Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today and in the future. My name is Marina and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So the webinar today is, as an AOD clinician, what do I need to consider about working with clients who may be using family violence? This webinar is a part of a series of Connect and Learn webinars designed to support AOD clinicians throughout Victoria. This webinar series is funded by the Victorian Department of Health and hosted by Turning Point. We like our webinars to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions via the Q&A function. So the questions will be collated and answered by our presenters at the end of the webinar. So please be aware that our webinars are recorded and then later made available on the Turning Point website. We encourage you to stay to the end of the webinar and complete the exit survey when the QR code appears on the slide, or also via email later today, which we'll send out to you. A copy of the slides will also be emailed to you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenters. So first of all, we've got Meg Bagnall, is a specialist family violence advisor in alcohol and other drugs, hospice to Bendigo Community Health Services. So since 2019, Meg has supported the AOD sector in implementing and embedding the MARAM framework within the AOD sector and the reform of VAOD assessment tools to screen, identify and assess family violence risk. Next, I've got Cindy. Cindy McKelvie is a specialist family violence advisor in alcohol and other drugs to the Salvation Army. Since the rollout of the MARAM framework, Cindy has supported community health services and more recently alcohol and other drug services to implement and embed the MARAM framework. Next, I've got Rachel Daniel, who's had over 30 years experience of working across multiple areas of the human and community services sectors in both government and not-for-profit agencies as a practitioner, a coordinator and a manager. Her current role is as the AOD SFVA in the Central Highlands region. With a focus on client-centred trauma-informed practice, Rachel believes that there is no substitute for collaborative practice. And finally, we've got Stephen Hurd, who's an AOD specialist family violence advisor located within Turning Point in the inner eastern Melbourne region. Stephen's worked in the area of men's family violence for over 10 years as a men's behaviour change co-facilitator, counsellor and groups coordinator. More recently, Stephen's become a social worker and spent some time working in prisons and is now well embedded with the Eastern Health Services. Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you and welcome. Thank you for your time today. This training has been put together for new and experienced workers alike. We have been doing the work for many years, and this is a reflection of the formalisation of requirements on alcohol and other drug workers. I just wanted to highlight that today's topic can be difficult and can trigger strong responses. If you need to take a break or step away, please do. And if you require follow-up support, please consider using supports available to you. We will provide some resources at the end of our presentation. I'd like to introduce Steve, who will be talking about the work we do with clients.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cindy, and hi, everybody. So what I'll be doing is talking about the work we do with people who attend our services who might be using family violence and how we can help make those decisions. So I'll be covering things like the challenges and opportunities that we have in the AOD sector. I'll be covering what we know about the intersection of family violence and AOD use. I'll talk through a few examples of how people who use violence may present themselves at treatment, and then try and answer the question, well, what can we do? So a few of the challenges really start at the idea that our client self-reports. And that means that we will only hear from what they have to tell us, which might include them hiding or masking abusive behaviours that they might be undertaking. Our clients may not know what family violence is. Some of them limit their knowledge to it being only a physical violence. And also we've got big concerns that we may upset the therapeutic relationship by having by introducing a family violence conversation. But what are the opportunities? The AOD and intake assessment tools really offer several places where a family violence conversation could commence. In 2021, the tools were aligned to MARAM in terms of victim survivor response, and early to late next year, they'll be reformed to have entry points into working with people who use violence and providing some guidance around that. AOD sector has a range of different treatment settings where different engagement styles can be adopted, formally within counselling or less formally within residential services, and also through the intake and assessment process. CRC offers its own opportunities to have those types of informal conversations. There's also a vast amount of existing knowledge that the AOD sector and clinicians have and built up over time. It's around interpersonal engagement, around motivational interviewing, around stages of change. And these are everyday sort of tools that we'd use, plus they're really important in working with people around their use of violence. And also there's a wealth of knowledge within the sector because people who use family violence have been attending AOD treatment for a long time. So the opportunity now really probably becomes one of formalising that operation. So what do we know about the intersection of family violence and AOD? So what really informs our clinical judgment? And certainly family violence is an ongoing pattern of coercive control creating fear. It's not really, and we're getting away from the idea that it's a one or two incidents. It's an ongoing pattern. Men are the predominant perpetrator of family violence and women are the predominant victim. And that just rings true in so much research. And if the partner uses too within an AOD context, then substance use coercion might be present, and that's something that could be explored. AOD misuse itself is a high risk factor as one of the evidence-based risk factors in MARAM. And we also want to have a strong indicator as to who is at risk. Is it a partner? Is it a mother? Perhaps an ex-partner and their kids. We also know that AOD doesn't cause family violence, but it really does contribute to the severity and frequency of that violence. And lots of research is coming out on that regard. Unfortunately, a lot of our clients, they do believe AOD causes family violence. So that type of psychoeducation provides us with a bit of opportunity for that conversation. What does underpin family violence, though, are the gender drivers. And they inform one's attitudes and beliefs. And that might lead to values of entitlement and superiority over women. And you'll hear a little bit later in my part of the presentation what that might sound like as we listen in to one of our clients and how they talk about their relationships and their partners. A perpetrator's use of violence differs from a victim's use of violence. On one hand, a perpetrator may use violence to gain control over another and instill fear, whereas a victim may use violence or force to counteract that violence in a defensive fashion. And family violence, as I've mentioned, is a common experience for many people seeking AOD treatment. And that's reflected in your own personal experience and knowledge, I'm sure, in your own clientele. So how might a client who uses family violence present at treatment, at any one of the treatment points? They can certainly treat as victims themselves. And that really is one of the big challenges. They can easily identify their own childhood experience of family violence, but not so much what might be happening here and now, but be quite able to discuss what's happening to them, but be unaware or not so forthcoming as to what their impact of their behaviour is on others, in particular their partners, their children. We also might hear blame, minimisation, justifying of behaviour, and even denial of behaviour, that all speak to the idea of where they see responsibility sitting. Do they see responsibility sitting with themselves, or do they see it with others? And that really gives us some insight as to where they feel they have control over their own behaviour. We might hear a lot about their partner. No, we focus on the other. We might hear a lot about her mental ill health. We might hear a lot about her poor parenting, or her inability to manage finances, or her cheating on him, or her use of violence. And those are indicators of wanting to speak about somebody else and not so much speaking about myself as the client. We might also experience charm from our clients, leading us to think they're a nice guy. Within the list of evidence-based risk factors, there are quite a few that are very common in those who present for treatment. AOD misuse, as I mentioned before, unemployment, self-harm, suicide, recent separation, they're all relatively common. Plus, as is mental illness. I've highlighted those ones in red because they are the higher risk factors for family violence. And when we talk about family violence risk, we are really talking about the idea of how a female partner may be killed or nearly killed by a current or former partner. Our clients might also show signs of remorse. They might be tearful or apologetic. And that's a really good thing to identify and to work with, as we'll see a little bit later. So what might you hear in the treatment setting? You might hear statements like, she didn't want the intervention order, the cops put it on me, or mum controls my money, or I broke up with my girlfriend 3 months ago and she's blocked my number. We've got relationship problems. Now, statements like that around saying we've got relationship problems really wants us to prompt, well, what does that really mean and look like? And is he saying the relationship problems are with the relationship, or are they actually around behaviour? She threw me out of the house. I can't even see my kids and I'm their father, which speaks to some kind of entitlement or deserving of some kind. She threatened to call the cops on me. Well, why did she threaten to call the cops? Or he might say, it was a toxic relationship. I'm glad I'm rid of her. My current partner is fine. Which sort of tells us they put the responsibility on her as to what the relationship was like. So what can we do? There's quite a range of things that we can think and carry with us as we work along. We can build on what they have said or referred to. It's important to hear them out though as well. At the same time, we have to sit and hear and prompt and sit with their narrative. But a key is to explore the risk through curious conversation, to maintain that curious lens. I've also said that if you get pushback or escalation, or if the victim narrative continues, then the best strategy really is to go back to the purposes to why they're there, for AOD treatment. So let's talk about why you're here, because those two other avenues will just not inform us too much, especially with pushback, which might escalate his behaviours, or the narrative, or a victim narrative, may entrench his views about being a victim. And again, I say, be curious and use open-ended questions. Further, we can consider family members. What would they like me to ask? Or if a partner uses, as I've said before, we can consider substance use coercion. A key skill or thing we can do is to return focus to him and his behaviour, his beliefs and his responses. Bring the family into the room, use their name, use the partner's name, use the mother's name, use the children's names. And then consider men's referral service if they show some kind of insight or motivation, where they can continue that discussion of why are things happening to me like this? Why do they keep repeating? Why do I feel so crap after I have a conflict with my partner? So if they are keen to explore those kinds of questions, then men's referral service is a great place to go. And I highlight there case noting identified risk factors. It's really important to identify them, to note them in our systematic language around what MARAM risk factors look like and sound like. Not perhaps for sharing today, but perhaps in anticipation of an information sharing request in the near future. And I'll just leave you with this decision grid that talks about whether family violence is present or not, and whether we explore it or not. And if family violence is not present and we don't explore, well, there's no change. If family violence is not present and we do explore, well, there's no change either. But if family violence is present and we don't explore, then there's a potential for decreased safety and perhaps a missed opportunity to intervene with this client. If we do explore and family violence is present, then we can have the opportunity to increase safety and to promote change. And a reflective question we can have around that idea of exploring or not exploring is, well, what might stop me from exploring a family violence conversation with my particular client? So thanks very much. I'll hand over to Meg to talk about visibility and accountability.
Thank you, Steve, for taking us through the work that we do with clients, which allows us to identify and begin to assess risk of family violence. As Steve mentioned, this is undertaken through the assessment of attitudes and beliefs, and it helps us to understand motivation for change. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this family violence practice that we're discussing is really undertaken as an extension of our current work with clients. Our client within this context is using family violence, but also has the right to engage with alcohol and other drug treatment in whatever capacity they choose to. We're not, this conversation isn't dismissing that right or that eligibility. It's really looking at how family violence practice extends our current AOD practice. The AOD sector has a long and sustained history of supporting everyone who walks through the door. Due to COVID, that's more metaphorical now, although we're starting to get back to business as usual. And this will never change. What the MARAM framework asks us to do is to maintain our person-centered, supportive and compassionate treatment approach, while also being curious, informed and aware of risk, particularly risk around family violence. I'd also like to acknowledge that through my presentation, discussing visibility and accountability can sound really cold and a little calculating. However, this is only a really small snapshot of the work that we're required to do to engage safely and support someone in AOD treatment who is using family violence. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A if you have any concerns around how it's presented. Hopefully it's okay. So over the next 10 minutes, we're going to have a look at some of the work that we do away from the client as we work to assess risk while also looking to amplify opportunities to increase visibility and accountability. We'll do this by looking at the MARAM framework responsibilities 5, secondary consultations and referrals, 6, accessing the information sharing scheme, and then how we can use this information in an informed way to meet responsibilities 9 and 10 around collaborative risk management. We'll also look at some of the identified challenges and benefits of extending our current AOD practice to include considerations of family violence risk. The MARAM framework, namely 5, 6, 9 and 10, can be broken into 2 key components of the work that we do when working with adults using violence. And that focus is around visibility and accountability. But what does visibility mean? To me, it means ruling out family violence risk as a risk consideration and understanding what the system identifies as current risk. To do this, we must assess risk in the work that we undertake with the client, as Steve has discussed. But we also have to do a bit of work away from the client. And that'll help us to identify and to begin our collection of evidence-based risk factors or to continue our collection of risk factors. As practitioners or clinicians, once we've identified family violence, we must be aware of what the system knows. This process of visibility in the system for adults using family violence is what our courageous advocates, such as Rosie Batty, have always referred to when demanding a systemic change to the way that services share information. This responsibility for increasing visibility can really easily be met by accessing the information sharing scheme. As many practitioners listening know, when we work with adults using family violence, the information sharing scheme is a really key component of every risk assessment. And it's been an absolute game changer because for the first time, we're not reliant on self-disclosure to inform assessments and assessments of risk. And Steve's covered that as well. In particular, accessing the information sharing scheme in alcohol and other drugs has become so common that AOD services have been identified as some of the highest requesters of information across the state. So I know how effectively our AOD sector and practitioners are already working within the scheme. Utilising the information sharing scheme to increase visibility has 3 key purposes. The first is that the information sharing scheme provides a detailed overview of risk relevant indicators. We use these risk-relevant indicators or evidence-based risk factors to predict future behaviour in the knowledge that within family violence, what has come before is a good indicator of what will happen in the future. Steve spoke about the importance of case noting our risk-relevant indicators, not just for now, for documentation purposes, and we'll get to that, but also to support future assessments. The second purpose of accessing the information sharing scheme is that it amplifies the voices of victim survivors to us practitioners. Through Victoria Police statements and application narratives obtained from the Magistrates Court, we can hear the victim survivors' experience, which reduces our risk of collusion when we're working with adults using violence in our services. The third purpose is to understand what interventions exist within the system currently. These interventions can also be referred to as touch points, and they're a key element to understanding not only risk, but who we can share that risk with. These touch points allow us to understand possible pathways for disruption, intervention, and accountability. An added benefit of the scheme is that requesting this information also increases the visibility and the validity of our assessment within other systems. As we share our identification and assessment that we've identified this person as a user of family violence, it ensures other systems also document our assessment. And this creates a reciprocal information pathway. In alcohol and other drugs, it's good practice to access the information sharing scheme as soon as we identify family violence. Typically, we begin by requesting information through the information sharing highway, seeking information from the big three: Victoria Police, Court Services Victoria, and Corrections Victoria. This information will provide us with a baseline of awareness about what information the system holds. From Victoria Police and Court Services Victoria, we'll know if the client has any current charges, is on bail, or has any intervention order obligations or pending court dates for matters of family violence. We'll know who the intervention orders are protecting, what the expiry dates are, and also what those obligations are on the order. We'll also be able to hear the voice of victim survivors through application narratives and, as I mentioned before, Victoria Police narratives. Corrections Victoria will share information with us around conviction history, and that conviction history gives us a detailed picture at times of those risk-relevant indicators: weapons offences, stalking offences. It'll also tell us if the client is on a current community corrections order, what the obligations of that order are, and which office is holding the case management. Now, as AOD practitioners, we'll have heard the experience of the victim survivor, and we'll be able to develop a detailed understanding of risk and any current interventions in place. We'll also be able to understand, based on these interventions and touch points, what expectations other services will have of our client, such as case plans, intervention orders, bail conditions, CCO. We'll also know who we can collaborate with to support risk management planning and to ensure the safety of our client, victim survivors, and the community. The work that we do with clients, as well as our detailed assessment of risk and interventions through visibility, allow us to enact our structured professional judgment. This process of enacting our structured professional judgment, it's a mouthful, is a core requirement of the MARAM framework. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with that through the victim survivor training that we've done. Now that we're able to see how the client is visible within the service system, we can look at the second key element of the work that we undertake away from clients, which is accountability. In order to hold adults using violence to account, we need to know what the risk is, what possible points of escalation are, and what interventions exist within the system. That's visibility. Accountability has three elements. The first is the sharing of that information we now know with services and sectors that have the power to hold adults using violence accountable. These systems typically have been Child Protection, Corrections, KISP, and Victoria Police. It's really important to follow your own organisational processes here, and if possible, consult with your AOD advisor, as at times the sharing of that risk-relevant information needs to be really carefully managed. The second is in documentation. And Steve's touched on this already. We have power within our roles, within our case notes, and through our engagement of systems of accountability, such as the courts, to document and reflect our professional judgment when it's safe to do so. Noting statements which include attitudes and beliefs, as well as risk, is really important. As stated earlier, follow your own organisational processes on documentation, particularly around the information sharing scheme. And the third key element is in our advocacy with other services and sectors. At times, this advocacy can be the most difficult element of our practice. However, supporting other sectors and services to see the risk as you do is highly valuable. Allowing others to share the risk you're holding will provide better outcomes for your client. As we stated already, our assessment of risk from client engagement work, as well as our work away from clients, informs this picture of risk that we hold, risk and support, as does our understanding of interventions around the client. This knowledge influences our structured professional judgment, and it informs the work that we do with our client and with those systems of accountability in the future. With this knowledge that we've obtained, we can now apply treatment pathways and options that support our client, but also support victim survivors who we may never meet. An example of this in practice may be when a client, an adult using violence, advises us that their intervention order has expired and they've returned to live in their family home with their partner and their children. We use the information sharing scheme to obtain a copy of the intervention order, which may inform us the intervention order has not expired and has a current exclusion condition. Now that we have that knowledge, we know of the intervention, we know the risk, and we know what systems of accountability are in place, namely child protection, we can share that information proactively with child protection to centre the safety of child victim survivors or young victim survivors. So now we know how to increase visibility and accountability for adults using family violence. What are some of the challenges posed by this increased pressure or workload? And that's the first challenge. There's a significant increased workload to practitioners, not only in understanding, assessing family violence risk, but also in disseminating the information that we get back through the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme. In response to that, we'll continue to be guided by the Department of Health around how this can be resourced, hoping, similarly to victim survivor funding, that it will be resourced in a similar way. Internal systems can also alleviate some of this load. Templates for requests and proactive sharing can save time. Risk summary templates can help disseminate information. And then we've got different pathways and programs in AOD, which may hold more flexibility or intensive responses that might be more suitable. So considering referring into other programs. Some systems are able to support us as well. If corrections hold case management support, sometimes we can defer to corrections to manage some of the work or accountability, proactive sharing, visibility, in order to alleviate some of the toll on our role. There are significant benefits to extending our practice in alcohol and other drugs to include the increase of visibility and accountability when we're working with adults using family violence. You'll see some of these benefits up on the screen now. Some of these include just how beautifully this work aligns to our current theory of stages of change and the harm minimisation model. We're actively employing motivational interviewing as a common practice across alcohol and other drugs. And that helps us in family violence to explore epistemological beliefs and attitudes. And while we aren't required to undertake the change work around family violence behaviours in alcohol and other drugs, we have a really strong foundation for being able to challenge unhelpful and sometimes harmful behaviours. There's significant value in utilising our professional judgment, as it allows us to assess all of the risk that our clients are experiencing and causing. Knowing this helps us to plan and to offer treatment outcomes that will be more effective for support and engagement. And they're more informed because systemic expectations are better understood. And finally, this is a really significant way that we can take some of the pressure away from victim survivors within our community as the primary reporters of risk. We have access to the information that we need in order to centre the safety of victim survivors child, youth, and adult in our practice. Accessing this information allows us to share the responsibility for this risk and, more broadly, to work to reduce and hopefully eliminate violence against women and children within our society. So now that we've got a really clear picture of risk and who's able to intervene to disrupt through risk protection capabilities, what do we do next? I'd like to warmly welcome Rachel, who's going to speak about the process and benefits of collaborative practice.
Thanks, Meg, for that, and thanks to Steve and Meg for their fantastic presentations. Today I'm going to look at what we need to consider as AOD clinicians in the work that we do with others when it comes to working with adults who use violence. And we'll do this in 3 parts. We'll look at why it's important, what are the benefits, and what can happen if we don't collaborate with other services. To put some perspective on collaborative risk management, the Royal Commission into Family Violence identified that services must work better together when it comes to addressing family violence risk. We've seen a history of service providers being quite siloed in their responses to family violence, and it was identified throughout the Commission's investigations that multi-agency risk assessment and management frameworks were so important. And this is when we saw the MARAM framework become legislated. And as we know, MARAM forms the foundation for taking a multi-agency collaborative approach to addressing family violence risk here in Victoria. And that falls under responsibilities 9 and 10 of the framework. And those responsibilities focus on collaborative work. Taking a multi-agency collaborative approach to responding to family violence risk increases the safety of victim survivors and provides us with a mechanism for keeping the adult using violence in view and accountable for their use of violence. You'll all have been involved in multi-agency collaboration throughout your careers, and you will have attended, no doubt, collaborative meetings with multiple other service providers who work directly with the adult using violence. And you would contribute to a coordinated process, shared decision-making and identifying actions to address risk. So why is it important and what are the benefits of collaborative work? So having a range of professionals working together provides opportunities to share information, concerns, to assess risk and for more informed decision-making. It helps to build strong networks and provides a platform for warm referral pathways, helps to identify priority actions, and also strategies on how best to engage the person that's using violence into the service system in a more meaningful way. You would have all experienced times as AOD clinicians where you felt that you had valuable insights or information to share in relation to clients who might be using violence. Historically, AOD clinicians have not always been fully utilised for the contributions in collaborative work, and often perhaps not always been seen as valuable when it comes to collaborative work. However, I dispute this. You all, as AOD professionals, have so much valuable input when it comes to working together with other services. When undertaking your work, whether it be as an AOD counsellor, withdrawal nurse, care and recovery coordinator, a youth outreach worker or an intake clinician, you are gaining valuable insights into a person's attitudes, values and their outlook on the world. Your clients will often share these insights with you and you may be privy to potential behaviours and risks that other services may not be. Your clients will often divulge information with you that they may not feel comfortable to share with other services. And this places you in a position to be an incredible asset when identifying and assessing family violence risk and being able to encourage your client to engage in the behaviour change processes and to also make warm referrals to programs and services such as the Orange Doors, men's behaviour change programs, Caring Dads, Dad's toolkits and other services that are out there across the state in relation to adults who use violence. By working together we can share the responsibility and not have to sit with high levels of risk individually. We can also ensure that the person using violence receives a consistent message about their use of violence and coercion. Working in the AOD sector, this may be engaging the person using violence in AOD treatment and support, which may then decrease risk of harm to victim survivors. When sharing information within a collaborative environment, you don't have to breach your client's privacy. This can be a concern to many people, particularly when you're working in a therapeutic way with clients. You don't have to share the entire content of your sessions with the care team. However, you are required to share risk-relevant information. Some examples of this may be if your client discloses a family violence incident during a session that you're having with them, if they make threats to harm another person, or you form a professional assessment that a person is at risk of harm or death due to information that has been shared or attitudes that you're observing in your sessions. And this information will assist with assessing risk and safety planning for victim survivors as well. As professionals, we must always work within the legislation when it comes to privacy and confidentiality. We must work within our agency's policies and procedures and always adhere to our duty of care and incorporate the MARAM information sharing schemes into your day-to-day practice, as Meg has just spoken about earlier. If you believe there to be an escalated risk of potential harm or death to a victim survivor, you're not required to seek consent from an adult using violence to share your risk concerns with the appropriate services. Our advice to you as professionals is that you don't need to sit with this risk alone. Share the risk, reach out to other services and service providers who might be engaged with the adult using violence, seek risk-relevant information and share your risk concerns so that you can respond in an integrated way. An integrated response allows a platform for comprehensive risk assessment, opportunities to identify any changing narratives and patterns of behaviour that the person may be displaying, and to intervene to prevent violence before it occurs. It ensures clear communication, the roles and responsibilities of each member of a collaborative team, and a chance for clinicians to discuss the different approaches that they take to working with and engaging adults who use violence. How you work with your clients in an AOD setting will be very different to how other services work with and engage the same client. Collaboration is vital, and strong collaborative partnerships play a critical role when we're addressing family violence risk. So what happens if we don't collaborate? So when services remain siloed where family violence has been identified, there can be multiple risks. And we know that siloing reduces the effectiveness of each of the services that may be involved in working with adults who use violence. And some of the services may become invisible in the overall management and support of the client. As mentioned earlier, AOD clinicians historically have often been invisible when it comes to the engagement of adults who use violence and being involved in collaborative multi-agency teams. So, but we're turning this around, and I think given the intrinsic link between the AOD and family violence issues, the specialist family violence sector is recognising the vital role that you as AOD clinicians play in identifying and assessing family violence risk. If we continue to work in a siloed way, we run the risk of ending up holding unnecessary levels of risk. It will create increased risk to the safety of victim survivors. Victim survivors will continue to have to retell of their experiences of violence. Adults who use violence will not be kept in view and not be held accountable for their use of violence. And there can be a lack of role clarity for the services involved. It can lead to continued perpetration of violence, a lack of access to appropriate service providers, and a greater risk of collusion when working with an adult who uses violence, as Steve spoke about earlier as well. As a clinician, you risk you risk not identifying or addressing family violence risk at all, and therefore leaving yourself open to scrutiny and questioning if something does go wrong. But by creating a multi-agency collaborative response to managing family violence risk, you're minimising the amount of risk that you must hold alone. And that way you're able to share the work across all of the people that are working with the person using violence. There's some fantastic examples of where taking a collaborative approach has been able to elicit better outcomes for the client and has increased safety to victim survivors. And these multi-agency discussions have included AOD clinicians working closely with specialist family violence services, corrections, and multiple other services. Regular collaborative meetings and strong communication about any observations of changes in behaviour and attitudes, evidence of high-risk factors, which Steve and Meg both spoke about earlier as well, sudden disengagement from services, disclosures of family violence incidents or threats to harm or kill themselves, current or previous partners, children, pets, or other family members can be shared and allow for appropriate actions and risk management to be put in place in a timely manner. Working together, services have been able to take a shared approach to identifying and managing any risks, thus allowing services to focus on their specific role with the person using violence. And services working together can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together. We can work together to establish and support a collaborative service system. As AOD clinicians, you have a unique understanding of your clients, particularly in relation to a person's capacity to undertake behaviour change processes and their attitudes and thought processes. This places you in a position to be valuable in collaborative meetings and to be of great benefit to the overall responses and safety planning when it comes to addressing family violence risk. And when we work together, we can make a difference. I'd like to now hand over to Cindy, who's going to talk more about self-care and vicarious trauma. Thanks, Cindy.
No worries. I am going to do the quickest version of this I can do because we're running out of time. So why is it important to talk about well-being in the context of this work? Because being involved in emotionally demanding situations over a prolonged period of time can cause vicarious trauma. I've lost my train of thought. So being involved in emotionally demanding situations over a prolonged period of time can cause physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. And being exposed to another person's trauma history can cause vicarious trauma. Unrecognised or untreated, this can have significant impacts. We understand that through working with people who use violence, we can be exposed to both their trauma stories and the trauma stories of victim survivors. Helpers impacted by working with traumatised individuals or hearing the trauma stories of others can experience vicarious trauma. This is a result of empathically resonating with what clients have told them about their experiences. Vicarious trauma is when your sense of self, your sense of relationships with other people, and your sense of the world is negatively transformed. You may also have similar physiological effects or symptoms as a traumatised person, such as poor sleep, intrusive thoughts, anxiety, and a feeling of being unsafe. There are factors that increase the risk of practitioners being impacted by vicarious trauma. These include a lack of balance between personal and work time, poor boundaries and coping skills, unrealistic expectations of yourself, inadequate supervision and training, a lack of resources, time or control over your work, and a lack of support and acknowledgement from management or organisational supports. Also, working with someone who's dealing with a situation similar to your own and experiences of your own personal trauma. Working over a long period of time in the field and having repeated exposure to the trauma stories of clients, periods of your own personal illness, and being overburdened with complex cases. To be able to protect ourselves from the effects of vicarious trauma, we have to build on our self-awareness and ability to understand how we are affected by the work. Empathy can be defined as the ability to bear witness to the client's experience without minimising, dismissing, or negating, where attention to the client's experience is met with a deep integrity of spirit or presence. Empathy is an essential component of helping roles. However, it's identified that when working with traumatised people, empathy is more at risk of being strained than in any other work. The framework of countertransference reactions is a psychological term which in a general sense is understood to mean the worker's reactions to what they're hearing and seeing from the people they work with. Empathic strain cannot be escaped in this work. It's part of the nature of the work and the condition of being human when exposed to traumatic stories and traumatised clients. But how a worker will react when empathy is strained can vary. And it's been observed that there is a range of reactions that can fall into two main categories. Over-involvement or over-identification, which can result in a desire to rescue clients, an excessive responsibility of people's feelings, fatigue, and a sense of having to do it all by yourself. The other category of avoidance or under-involvement presents as withdrawing from the client or the work, denying the client's stories or the seriousness of their stories, a preoccupation with efficiency, or becoming cynical. Thinking about these reactions after today's webinar, take some time to think about the following. Have you observed any of these reactions in yourself or in colleagues? What conditions precipitated this? Remembering these are common reactions to working with traumatised people, and it's important not to judge yourself or others the response, but rather pay attention and address your own. It's important to have strategies to put a healthy distance between yourself and the trauma stories you hear, while still being empathically engaged. Almost everyone has heard about the term self-care, and there are many activities that fall into the category of caring for yourself. Each person is unique and needs to spend time exploring activities that are healing or restorative for them. But the key aspects to self-care are maintaining a personal life away from work, identifying healing activities, maintaining and building a sense of humour, having realistic expectations and good boundaries. In addition to self-care, organisations have a responsibility to provide support for those who are engaging in work with trauma stories. Some of these responsibilities are providing supervision, promoting work-life balance, ensuring a safe, comfortable environment, ensuring adequate resources, and promoting an atmosphere of respect and support. You can do all the self-care in the world and take advantage of all the organisational care opportunities and still feel burdened, deeply saddened, and without hope. Helpers also need to find a way to make meaning and sense out of their experience. Meaning can be found in simple activities and often includes an existential awareness of the here and now. To really engage in meaning making, it's important to accept that you're in the process of change and allow for this transformation. Transformation referring to the active exploring and working through negative beliefs, feelings of despair and loss of meaning that can result from trauma exposure. The process of making meaning and through this, finding purpose and motivation for life is important for people who have experienced trauma. And it's the same for people that work with traumatised people. It's a parallel process. Healing and recovery occur through the process of making meaning, finding purpose and motivation for life. Meaning making can occur in many ways, and as is the case with self-care, you need to find the methods and inspirations that suit you. This can include self-exploration, art, engaging in community activities, discussing and exploring the human experience, or a faith and spiritual practice. Despite the emphasis on the negative impacts of working with trauma survivors and trauma stories, the importance of taking care of yourself in this space, there are tremendous benefits to this experience as well. A deeper understanding of the world, suffering and humanity's capacity to overcome, a greater sense of meaning, a renewed or changed spirituality, greater value of your own appreciation of your own relationships, a greater degree of compassion, and a greater sense of fulfillment, purpose, or pleasure. Thank you so much for attending today. We hope you've taken something from today's presentation on what do I need to consider when working with an adult using family violence. If you are interested in any further information or learning, please contact us or use the resources provided. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cindy. And I'd like to extend a big warm thank you to Cindy, Rachel, Steve and Meg for that wonderful presentation. That was really, really informative. So we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers now. So there've been a few coming through, and I've just collated a couple. There've been a few similar ones. The first one I'd like to ask to the panel is with the information sharing scheme, is it a national scheme? So is there something similar in, for example, the ACT or New South Wales? So a couple of people have specifically asked about those states.
Thanks, Marina. I'm happy to jump in and answer that question. So the legislation is Victorian legislation, so it is relevant only in Victoria. So there's particular protections that are afforded to practitioners under the scheme, but if you're a practitioner operating in New South Wales, you're not protected under Victorian legislation. We'll also be unable to obtain information about behaviours or, say, conviction history from New South Wales. So if we're, you know, it's obviously been a significant issue for organisations in border towns. So in those times, I would encourage you to lean into your relationships with services such as corrections, who can access information interstate, which can support your assessment of risk and increasing visibility and accountability.
Fantastic, thank you.
Sorry, Marina, I should just jump in and say, sorry, there is an information sharing scheme in both New South Wales and in Queensland, but they have different obligations and different thresholds.
All right, thank you. I've just got another question. Steve spoke about a time when you would return to the AOD use issue of a client who may be a person who uses violence. So could you elaborate a little bit more about that? Like, for example, how far would you go in asking questions about a perpetrator's behaviour? And what kind of things they might say or do that lead you to return to the AOD questions?
Yeah, great question. It's one of those fine lines and boundaries that we'll reach. Primarily, we're AOD clinicians, and it's stated we're not family violence clinicians, and we don't do family violence work. The work we do is family violence risk assessment type work, though, so the exploration component. And I think I highlighted two examples, two ways where we might need to modify that and bounce back. One is when we perceive escalation or real pushback, and we get that just through the client's body language, pushing back, or terse, obtuse type answers, monosyllabic answers, and completely disengaged from the whole concept. The risk we run by pursuing a conversation then is in further escalating, perhaps being safe within the session, but the risk of returning home and escalating there. The second example I had was when a client maintains a victim narrative, really deflects us to see his victim point of view. And again, we're not trained in assessing whether someone's a victim of this. What we want to do is try and get a sense of what they think about their behaviour and the impact on others, not so much the impact on them. However, if that narrative continues, then there are two places we can ask them to continue that exploration for themselves. One is at the men's referral service, potentially. And the second one, if they do want to, if there is a crime that's been committed and they do want to pursue their victim rights, they can do that through victims of crime. Again, they're both specialist areas. And so I would say at that point, we would come back and then return back to why they're at your particular AOD service. So hopefully that clarifies or expands it for the questioner.
Thank you, Steve. So we might leave it there. So we're sort of running short on time. I've got a couple of more questions that hopefully the panel can answer. If I have concerns, this is from Jack, if I have concerns of risk of family violence, if I want to share information, should I be sharing it with Orange Door, for example, or every service I'm aware that the client is engaged with? So do the organisations, in short, have to be MARAM aligned?
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Yep, I'll jump in and answer this one. Great question, Jack. Absolutely. So we can only share information with other information sharing entities. Some information sharing entities are also risk assessment entities. So you might hear that ISE as well as REE language. So we can only share under the legislation, and we can only share with other information sharing entities. It may not be necessary that you share information with everybody. I think I would lean into Rachel's presentation around collaborative risk management and making sure everyone is in the same room and talking about risk together. That's not only how we can share the responsibility for risk, but also how we can pick up the nuanced risk we might be picking up in different sectors, because we'll all have different relationships and different information that we're holding.
Fantastic.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly and add to that, and just say also to note, if you have consent to share information, that does also count. I just think it's worth remembering we also have consent documents that can give us the ability to share with organisations that don't fall under MARAM.
Thank you, Cindy. What's just another question? What sort of AOD or DV collaborations would you encourage for remote regional organisations and communities?
Yeah, I'll jump in for that one. Yeah, it's interesting the difference sort of between metro and regional, but certainly in regional areas, when you have concerns about risk, if you're aware that the client's engaged with any other services that might be information sharing entities, then certainly seek information, particularly when it comes to adults who use violence. I think, the Orange Door is always a really great first port of call for information sharing, to try and get any historical information that you can, whether there's intervention orders in place and those sorts of things, as a good starting point. But certainly, if you're aware that there's other services involved, seek consent, as Cindy said, as you normally would as a part of your work, to share with other services. If you don't have consent, but you have concerns about risk to another person, when it comes to adults using violence, you don't need to have consent from that person to share your concerns. So, yeah, but definitely, as I said, the Orange Door is always a good starting point for information sharing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. Look, we are going to leave it there. If I could just ask the panel, so a couple of people have asked for the references to be put up again, so we might just do that quickly for you. And also, if you could, we've got the evaluation survey, so we'll go back to that just before we finish. So if you could click on the QR code, would be fantastic. Any questions that we didn't answer today, we will email, hopefully respond to, and then email that through to people. The slides will be available, and we'll be emailing those to you. So fantastic. Thank you so much for everyone who came today. And again, a lovely, warm, special thank you to the panel.